All right, so let's open up with our second day keynote, Carolyn J. from University of Manchester.
Excellent. Okay, so yeah, it's really interesting for me to be here. I very much enjoyed yesterday. I learned a lot. I'm from the Software Sustainability Institute, where I'm the research director. And I was invited to speak, I think, at this particular conference because we've been doing quite a lot of work. We do quite a lot of meta research, I think, at the Software Sustainability Institute, where we're looking at providing, as well as our main kind of purpose, which is supporting people who write software for research. We're also doing this kind of meta research, providing an evidence base for why it's important to do that and what factors influence it. And today I'm going to talk about professional identity and culture and how those impact our work. And I'm going to talk about it particularly from the perspective of resilience engineering, which I'll explain shortly. But this is a project that was done with the Open University, so the Software Sustainability Institute were partners. And it was run by Helen Sharp from the Open University, who has a lot of expertise in software engineering and human-computer interaction. And the part that I'm going to talk about is also led by Lancaster, so Mark Levine and Melanie Langer were the people who are working on it there. So the project was called STRIDE, and this stands for Socio-Technical Resilience in Software Development. You can sort of get STRIDE out of that if you try hard enough. Anyway, that's what we've been calling it. And this idea of resilience is a really interesting one. So I think in software engineering generally, we tend to think about things in terms of deficit or lack. So we think about errors, right? And it's really important that we do that because errors are a big problem. They're a problem in all software, but particularly in research software and scientific software, if we have a bug in our code that's affecting our results, it means those results are wrong. So we really need to worry about it. But actually, there's a different way of framing this issue. So really what we can demonstrate is that if you think about this in terms of resilience rather than deficit, so errors and lack, you can then start to identify what the factors are for hopefully producing code that is less likely to contain those errors and bugs to begin with. So this is what resilience engineering is all about. It's about trying to understand what it is that makes teams robust to making mistakes and makes them sort of able to cope with change. So in particular, it means here the intrinsic ability of a system to function in the face of change. And we talk about socio-technical resilience. What do we mean by that? Well, often I think in computing, we're moving beyond this now. I think the discussions yesterday showed that in the sense that we were talking about people and skills as much as we were talking about sort of hardware and platforms. But it's typical to regard a system in terms of input and output, right? And where we consider the person in that is perhaps the person's providing some input and interprets the output. But we sort of don't consider necessarily the person as part of the system. And it's really, really important that we do, because there are all these factors in the external environment and intrinsic to the person that are going to be affecting how they perform that job. So they are as much a part of the system as any of the hardware or the software. And I think the other reason it's really important for us to think about resilience in software engineering at the moment is that basically automation, increasing automation of what we do, is absolutely endemic. So I think it's endemic actually in all professions now, right? I think we're starting to get to that point. We're moving in that direction, but we've been dealing with it for a while. So increased automation. So at a collaborations workshop, so that's the SSI, Software Sustainability Institute's annual event, we had a session where we were looking at what research software engineers, RSEs, think about this expansion of automation. And this was in 2023. So ChatGPT was people were just starting to understand how, LLMs could be embedded in the coding process and so on. And it won't surprise you. So we frame it as automation rather than LLM specifically because is there a difference? Don't know. That's a sort of open to debate. Is there a step change in the difference it makes? I mean, for me, I think the main difference is that it opens up coding to people who perhaps have less of an understanding of it. That's a debate for another time. But for RSEs, for research software engineers who do this as part of the job, not people who are new to it, it was unsure whether they viewed it as qualitatively different. None of these will surprise you. We can see some things around increased productivity and so on the left. And then again, exactly what the panel were talking about yesterday, different skill set, new curricula, obfuscation of skills, this kind of thing, obfuscation within the code, increased complexity, loss of provenance, all of these things. So it's kind of like, on the one hand, actually, this can help us systematically potentially be, so we're talking about automation, not LLM specifically, but help us systematically improve. Automated testing is a great example of that. On the other hand, it makes stuff difficult for us, in terms of having to learn new things and new technologies. And so we have this environment which is changing constantly. We know that change, is a major issue for us. And, just thinking about research. So I think about research software a lot. How do we write this software? How do we maintain it? The reason the SSI was set up is because the minute you stop maintaining software, like it ceases to work. Okay, and this comes as a surprise to people. I think in the beginning, PhD student writing code and then trying to get it to run later on. But actually, it's just a major issue for us. So it's something obviously that is on my mind. So why are we thinking about identity in this context, and why does it matter? So social identity is extremely important. It provides us with our kind of sense of self, our sense of belonging, provides us with this link to a social group. Social groups, for humans, it's incredibly important to be part of a social group. That's how you survive. If you're not part of a social group, it's extremely difficult to survive on your own. It's key to our sense of self, and it brings all of these benefits to our health and well-being. So it's really important that we understand these things. And of course, these things are very much at play in the workplace in the same way that they are in social groups. And of course, those two things overlap a great deal, as we'll come to. So we're talking about professional identity here. So in particular, the RSE identity. Other professional identities are available. We'll come to that. And so what I wanted to do actually first, and I think it's really important we do this when we're doing research, is sort of reflect myself on my own professional identity and what that means and how that affects the way that I work. So I have a background in psychology and computer science. So my first degree was in psychology. And then I did a master's in computer science, and then I worked for a relatively short time as a software engineer and came back to do a PhD in computer science. And ever since then, I have been combining those two disciplines in the work that I do. So what are the consequences of that? So now I think it's becoming more common. It's more common to sort of, be interdisciplinary in general and to bring those two things together. When I started doing that about 20 years ago, actually it's probably longer than that. Anyway, when I started doing that, it was not common at all. Like I was the only person in that situation in my Department of Computer Science at the time. And of course, what this means is to computer scientists, I'm a psychologist, and to psychologists, I'm a computer scientist. So I don't really have a home. And I'm one of those people who kind of sits, and I think other people in the room will be familiar with this, but in a different way, who sits on the edge of groups, providing sort of maybe expert input from time to time, but isn't necessarily part of a strong team where everybody identifies the same way. So I have lots of experience of kind of being the outsider and needing to be brought in and welcomed into teams where perhaps, I'm slightly different to everyone else. So, I mean, it's worked fine for me. I've made a career out of it, so that's all good. And I think as well, it's interesting, again, thinking about personality types. So we know about introverts and extroverts, people who need to get their energy from other people, and people who find that other people sap their energy and actually they need some alone time in order to recover. Yeah, and actually we know that it's a lot more diverse than that now, and often you can get people who actually can in some ways be slightly more comfortable sitting slightly outside groups. So there are lots of factors at play here. So there are kind of, these intrinsic personality factors, but also, and this is what I'll come to, there are some really, really important environmental factors that affect how we feel about our work and how we regard our own identity at work. And it turns out that that is really, really important. So what we were examining here in particular is the RSE and identity, right? So this term, research software engineer, and specifically that term. We're looking at how it's changed over time. And we're also looking at whether it improves professional outcomes. So if you are somebody who calls themselves an RSE, and you do research software engineering work, obviously, if you're doing other work and you call yourself an RSE, it might be slightly different. But let's say you're writing software for research, which is how we define this. Does it improve your professional outcome if you hold that identity? And of course, the other thing we're interested in, does it improve resilience? So we did this in a couple of ways. We used a survey and we used some social media analysis. So the RSI identity, some of you in the room will be familiar with this story, others maybe less so. It goes back to the collaborations workshop in 2012, the sort of establishment of this term. So other people, I think, may have been using it before then. Some people may have been using it before then, but it wasn't really established term, that was widely recognised. And there's a blog post, I think, associated with this that's come out of the collaborations workshop in 2012. And this really matters. What we call ourselves really matters. The words we use make a big difference. So what we all kind of self-define in slightly different ways, and there are lots of nuances there. And it's interesting thinking about this term RSE, research software engineer, versus the other things that we could call ourselves. So we could have a software engineer or a software developer. So this is something that, I've heard this debate before, what's a software engineer, what's a software developer? And people try to determine in technical terms. My own way of classifying is that one carries a messenger bag with their laptop and the other carries a rucksack. And I'll leave you to decide which way around that might be. Anyway, so these names matter. And I think this is really well illustrated by, again, another session at a collaborations workshop, you must come, where a group sat down to try to distinguish the difference between a data scientist and a research software engineer. Okay, so this was a team of leaders, primarily, and they were interested in employing people with both of these skill sets, so data science skill sets and software engineering skill set, research software engineering. And so they thought, right, what we'll do is we'll basically just come up with the job descriptions for each of these two things, and then we'll be able to publish them, and this will really help the community, and we'll do a blog post about it, and we'll publicize what we've done. And I don't know whether you can see where this is going. Anyway, so they discussed this for a couple of hours, and then it turned into days and weeks, and they were kind of, and in the end, they ended up writing this blog post, research software engineers and data scientists, more in common, because they could not work out what the differences were, okay? Couldn't see what the differences were. And to illustrate this, what might happen is a data scientist may say, well, what I'm really interested in is scientific results. I'm interested in interpreting data and understanding the results from data. And a research software engineer will say, well, hang on, I'm a research software engineer. I'm interested in that too. Research is absolutely central to what I do. And then an RSE would say, Well, actually, what I'm really interested in making sure that actually all the processes we're using are extremely robust, right? And we're rigorous in the way that we're doing our data analysis, and we're making sure we're using good practice. And a data scientist will say, well, hang on, are you saying that my software is not robust? That I'm not using good practice? You know, right? You can see where this is going. And yet, you still get this distinction. So you will still have people who will identify as data scientists, and you will still have people who identify as RSEs. So the name is important, and it's important to those people, but it's very difficult to distinguish between them. So we did an analysis of Twitter and blog posts. So this is a social media analysis. And we did this since 2012. So we went right back to the advent of this term. And we decided that we would look at, you know, what's happened in social media since then. So I'm trying to think, we were looking at, so in terms of, so we look at Twitter via the API, we're looking at blog posts from, like, we looked at the Society of RSE when that came along, we looked at the Slack channels before then, so all of these things. And the important thing with social media analysis is that it enables that by looking at the language in context, it allows us to pick out the parts that show how those terms are being used. Okay, so you look at the term RSE, and then you look at the surrounding language, and it gives you these indications about how people are feeling. So what are the indicators that we saw? So as you move through time, the use of the word I decreases, and we increases. Okay, so this is really interesting because it shows that this group identity is starting to form. So people are much less likely to talk about what they're doing on their own, and much more likely to think about what the group is doing and what they're achieving. One thing that was really interesting, though, was that we didn't see, and I think this is, I would regard this in positive terms, is we didn't really see out-group differentiation going on. So it's very, very common. One of the ways that a group establishes itself or has an identity, like we're in a rugby stadium at the moment, you know, is by having your in-group, your own team, and having the out-group, which are other teams. And so we didn't see that happening. So it wasn't like these blog posts or the Twitter or whatever. It's like, oh, well, we RSEs know what we're doing, but those data scientists over there don't, right? So we weren't seeing that happening. So that's probably a positive thing, I think, for the community at large. And this is my favorite one: anger and negative emotion decreased over time. So this is our first indication that this professional identity is really important, because you see early on, and again, this is very common, a lot of people, quite reasonably, I would say, were very frustrated that their work wasn't being recognized. So they were writing software research, but they were often called, say, they may be employed as postdoctoral research associates, they may be PhD students, and they didn't really feel that they were being properly represented. So a very common thing is that they were working as PDRAs, but they spend all their time developing software. And I know that Tobias said yesterday, and I agree that we should write more papers about that. I agree with that. However, it's quite difficult to find the time to write lots of papers when you're writing a lot of software. Okay, and so it was sort of, you know, people felt that they were not being credited for the work that they were doing. So that's one of the reasons the establishment of this term was so useful. And of course, then you have this role established, and then of course people can employ you in that role. So you don't have to be employed as a postdoc anymore. You can be employed as an RSE, and we see that happening now. And that would not have happened if we didn't have this term. And I think it's very interesting, actually, when we think about job roles more generally. So people in this room will have lots of different job titles. So we use RSE here. Obviously, you could be a scientific software developer. You could be, you know, there are lots of other ways that you could use the term. And I had a really interesting conversation yesterday with a colleague from EPSRC about this. So it's even this RTP term is kind of like, I'm not going to say it's problematic is too strong. I don't think that's fair, but it's like, I've realized I use this term a lot, right? So I work in kind of senior university leadership, and I like to think about all of our kind of staff who do sort of, I'm going to use the word technical jobs, even that is problematic. We can call them research technical professionals, but you'll find that people don't like that. So RSEs don't really identify that way, and then we have digital research technical professionals, and I don't know, do I feel part of that group or not? I don't know. And then we have, experimental officers, and we have people who are being termed research technical professionals, but actually would prefer to view themselves as technical specialists. So why might that be? Well, I don't know. It's often historical, but also things like, when you have professional in the title, does that sound more administrative? Does that sound more professional services and less research? Don't know, but these things make a difference and they matter. Okay, so following the social media analysis, we did a survey. So we ran this internationally. We had 381 responses, quite a wide mix of disciplines. So the question that we asked people is basically, do you write software that's used for research purposes? Okay, so that was we were very broad in our remit. 12 countries, roughly 9 years experience. So we had people more experienced, people less experienced. And we had a mix as well of industry, university and government. So this wasn't just people from universities, although that was the majority of respondents, but we did have people from other areas as well. And we asked them some questions about their identity and whether they identified with being a research software engineer. We also asked them questions about resilience, so going back to understanding how this might contribute to, in this case, personal resilience, but we asked them about their team and their working environment as well. So on the one hand, this is all self-reported, but on the other hand, it's kind of an appropriate way. So these are we used established psychological instruments for all of these things. So these are validated questionnaires. And of course, self-report's not perfect, but it kind of captures what we're interested in here, which is how satisfied people feel in their jobs, how much they identify as an RSE, and how well they think they and their team do in the face of change. Yeah, so these positive professional outcomes here: how successful do you feel? How satisfied are you with your job? Do you feel it's meaningful? And how well does your team work? So what we found was, of this group, 77% held this RSE identity. Now, it doesn't mean it was the only one they held. So they might say, I identify as an RSE. An important part of how I see myself is being a research software engineer. Or I feel solidarity with research software engineers. So 77% were answering yes to those kinds of questions. But actually 99% had a domain identification as well. So this means that they also held an important identity as a, I don't know, a classicist or a physicist, or whatever domain they were working in, right? So that was really important to their identity as well. So we see again, RSE is not necessarily, in this, from a professional perspective, exclusionary. And what we found was that identifying as an RSE for these kinds of people who write software for research, we found it was associated with things like how successful they felt, whether their work was meaningful, and so on. So it's had that positive association. So we also looked at autonomy. So this is methodological or operational autonomy. Things like, I am allowed to decide how to do my job. It's interesting. Scheduling or administrative autonomy. So that basically means I can choose when I do particular activities. I've got somebody telling me when I must do it. Critical and strategic, so I can identify and modify my own objectives. And what we found was that self-defining as an RSE is associated with having higher levels of all of these types of autonomy. Okay, so I don't know whether that's there's a difference there between people not identifying as an RSE. Perhaps they're feeling less, because research, we know it's quite important that people have autonomy in terms of how they do it. I don't think research projects work very well if it's one person telling everyone else what to do. So that was interesting. And what did it mean for resilience? Having this identity, did it make people more resilient? So there are various different types of resilience that we're interested in. So monitoring is basically, keeping an eye out for threats and issues and problems. Responding is when you notice these, you're able to take them into account and change, and you find that easier rather than harder. When something goes horribly wrong, you're able to learn from it. And also being able to anticipate it as well. Now, this one's quite tricky. It's always difficult to anticipate something. But I think like the discussions we were having yesterday and the discussions that I think do happen in these forums about what's next, what's around the corner. I think that's really helpful in terms of just getting these things in the back of your mind helps to improve resilience. So when something does happen, it's not completely out of nowhere. And what we find is people who hold that identity, again, are more likely to, report high levels of resilience. So this applies to both the individual and at the team level as well. So, great. It's all very positive. Everyone should identify as an RSE. This is great. But I know what you're thinking. I know, we've had all this great stuff. And so the question is really, is there a dark side to identity? And maybe even, is there a dark side to RSE identity? So, the answer to this question is, of course, yes, in the sense that, and we see it in politics quite a lot at the moment, that, this out-group differentiation, so that can be an issue. So, people hold a very strong identity and then they dislike other people and so on. So we don't necessarily think that's going on with RSE. As I said before, we don't see that being a strong issue. Okay, we don't view the RSE professional identity as necessarily being intrinsically exclusionary. God, that's a sentence, isn't it? Okay, I'll explain what I mean by that. So what we don't see is necessarily that it's kind of the professional part of this is an issue. But we do see that the people who do identify as RSEs come from a very, very specific group. And probably you can predict what that group is. And it was really, what I'm going to talk about now is a really, really important lesson for us in the Software Sustainability Institute. So one of the things that we spend an awful lot of time on is trying to improve diversity and trying to be inclusive. So inclusive is not a great term. I'm going to come back to that later on. But what I mean by it is when we run events, we make sure that we have like diverse speakers. So demographically, so gender diversity, ethnic diversity, domain diversity, all of these things. So we make sure we do that. We have a code of conduct. We make it really clear to people what they should and shouldn't be doing at the conference, how to avoid excluding people. And we thought, we're doing such a great job of this, we haven't got this out group and, we're doing really well. And actually, when we did the analysis of it, so this is some work that I did with Jeremy Cohen, Neil Chu-Hong at the Software Sustainability Institute. We analysed the RSE survey. So at the time, this was it's a while ago now, it's 2018, so we're just redoing this analysis now. But the point still holds, even though it's a few years ago. So hopefully things have improved, but the point still holds. So we thought we were doing such a great job, and we have this lovely RSE community, which had come from the Software Sustainability Institute. And actually, we weren't at all. So what we found when we analysed the respondents to this was that they were less ethnically and gender diverse than academia as a whole, perhaps. Gender, perhaps not a surprise, because 46% of people who work in academia are female. So, we know from the pipeline and the throughput that that's not necessarily going to be the case. Ethnicity, really, really poor. So 5% of people in the survey were from Black, Asian or minority ethnic backgrounds. Everyone else was white. And the thing that's really concerning about this as well is that it holds up really badly against software engineering. So this is not just a, oh, well, you know, like women don't do computer science degrees problem. This is like, we do worse than the software engineering industry generally. So software engineering actually, from an ethnic diversity perspective, is slightly better than other professions. So we're doing really badly in research software engineering. And it's just like, why would this be? And so I don't actually know the answer to that. I'd be interested in hearing from anyone who does. I can guess. I have some thoughts about why it might be. I think it's to do with, you know, the fact that this is still a relatively new profession. There's precarity associated with it. I think that it's more likely to happen at some universities than others, right? So it tends to be bigger, well-financed universities that are more likely to maybe employ RSEs. It's really complex. It's really complex. But there is something going on here that means that people from certain groups aren't necessarily identifying as RSEs, even when they're doing that work. This is the thing. So they're doing the work, but they're not holding that identity. So what do we do? Okay, where do we go from here? So I kind of want to think about this in terms of embedding resilience. Okay, so how do we do that in our teams, in our projects, in our communities? Well, we need to recognize, I think, first of all, that software quality is influenced by its surroundings. So it is not just the case that you can guarantee software quality by just having a programmer who doesn't make mistakes. You know, I want one of those, but it's like it's influenced by so many other things. It's, you know, it's influenced by the relationships within the team. Obviously, it's influenced by things like, you know, the infrastructure you're working in, the technical infrastructure, but also the human infrastructure. It's influenced by the organizational culture. So again, thinking about things like precarity, you know, obviously we all know that if you have somebody leave the team because their contract's finished, this causes issues. So we have a situation where we need to be thinking about this at all sorts of different levels in order to make sure that we're able to kind of respond to change, and when things go wrong, it's not too much of a problem for us. I think the results from our survey around autonomy were really interesting as well. And I think this is about wider, I'm going to say academic culture. I think this is important in actually in all organisations. I don't think it applies just to academia, but I think it's more of a problem sometimes in academia. We can see that resilience is associated with people being able to make decisions themselves. And in a lot of research teams, that will be the case, but it isn't in all of them. And I think this is, you know, really important evidence that actually allowing people autonomy and supporting them with that doesn't mean like one person goes off and does what they want and no one else knows what's going on. Right? Good team communication too. But having that autonomy and allowing people that autonomy is really important for, you know, them being able to respond to problems. Yeah, so this one, focus on the professional part of identity. So this is one of the things that I think is probably a major issue. So I have quite a strong, so I talked earlier, you know, about, am I a computer scientist? Am I a psychologist? Well, I'm a computer scientist, okay? That is how I identify. I mean, I've been in a computer science department for a long time. Those are the journals I publish in and so on. But it's not just about that. It's not just about that. I feel part of that group. And I think the reason I feel part of that group is because when you learn to think computationally, I think, and I did this relatively late on, okay, so I don't think I really did this until I was like 21, so I haven't really, so I haven't said this before in public, but I studied language A-levels, right? So my background really is quite different to everyone else in the room. Have a Bachelor of Arts degree. Anyone else got a Bachelor of Arts degree? Yay. Okay, a few people. Excellent. Right. So I was kind of late coming to this, but it had a really profound impact on me. So when I started thinking computationally, it's affected like my whole life. I genuinely think that, and I think this is why, because I think computer scientists, I think it is quite a welcome, by the way, given all I have said and about to say, I think that, this environment generally, I've always found it to be a very welcoming environment. And it's because it's full of people who are quite straightforward and think about things in sensible ways. And, and I think it is, so that part of learning to be a computer scientist has really had a massive effect on me, and I think affected the rest of my life as well. So that is a really, really important part of it. But the other side of it, so that's great, right? That side of it is great. But have I been in situations where it's been less positive in terms, oh, sure, yeah, right? So I don't know whether we'll touch on this in the panel later, so I won't say too much, but I mean, yeah, I've been in situations where people just haven't been able to understand how I've managed to get a job as a computer science lecturer. Because just look at me. I mean, this was a while ago, but still, and there are lots of things that can happen in the environment in terms of how people behave with each other. And a lot of these can be social, okay? So you might have a situation where like a speaker makes a joke that is kind of exclusionary to some part of the audience. And that's fine because, normally that, this is just how they identify and this is how the team identifies and that's how they draw their identity. But, it's for those people who maybe aren't 100% sure whether they should be there, it can be a bit like, it's difficult. And so we have to think about these things all the time. And so actually, rather than thinking about inclusion, which I think is like including means we're kind of actively trying to bring people into, what we're doing, what we're thinking. I actually think that valuing belonging is the most important thing. So what we want is not for the in-group to be including people from the outside. What we want really is for everyone to feel that they belong in this environment. Okay, and we can have different views and we can come from different backgrounds and we have different perspectives, but we kind of share some values and we all feel that we can be ourselves and get on with the task at hand, right? Get on with our work really productively. So I will finish there, but I'm really interested to talk with people about this further. So do ask questions at the panel, and if you have any thoughts or questions now, I'd be really happy to answer them.
Thank you. Really interesting talk. Did you ask those who identify as RSE what their career aspirations are? Because this may have a lot to do with why the diversity is not there. Others may see their career or see role models that are not RSEs, and therefore that they need to identify in a direction that will give that. It's a real tension because you can't all end up with the academic career, but if you think you might want it, you have to do certain things to position yourself for it, or you have to take an identity that can move you out without mental crises over it.
Yeah, absolutely, Viv, totally agree. And yes, I think there's an awful lot in that. So what the work we're doing at the moment, so we couldn't answer that question with this particular survey, but we are doing some work at the moment to understand that more, to understand why it is that people who are doing very similar roles might identify in different ways. But yeah, we absolutely hypothesize that it has a lot to do with that. And I think part of it, and this is so these things are all tensions, right? And there's no right or wrong answer, and there's no right way to identify them. But I think it was interesting for us to see that we have people doing the RSE work, and I think this was the challenge. We have people who are doing the RSE work, so essentially writing more code than papers, kind of as a way of thinking about it. But yes, who absolutely was still aspiring to be in a sort of more standard academic position, for example. And I think there are lots of things that influence that. And it's interesting that we at the moment, I think this is changing as well, but we don't view somebody, do we? So I do know academics now who write more code than papers. I think it's still difficult for them, right? It does happen, it's possible, but yes, I think you're absolutely right. We are exploring that further. But I think, again, it's like you would sort of still expect across different demographic groups to have that spread. And if you don't get it, it's interesting to understand why. And we don't know why for sure, but we are looking at it.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. I'm a chemist by background, and in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths, we've got a similar problem. The undergrads, we've got about 50-50.
Yeah.
Yeah. Give and take, for the sake of this argument, 50-50, it's easy. And then somehow all of the women are disappearing. And we've got no idea why. Is it because women want to have children and hence they need to have, how to put it, special circumstances, like you've got a child in your belly, you can't really work as you normally would do, put in here whatever you want. Maybe we've got similar things here, because why is it there are, if you look around, so few women around? If you look around, and that is not a stitch at anybody, predominantly it is a white audience. Why? Is it because the pipeline is simply drying up? And hence, at the end of it, where we are sitting here, there aren't any women we can recruit. What are we doing wrong here?
So I'm going to offer my opinion. This is backed up by some evidence as well. So when this happens, it is because we are doing stuff wrong. Okay, right? Socially, usually, I would say there are problems occurring. So we don't see the attrition of women in other disciplines in the same way. So I would argue it's not just because women have children. I would say that that's not the thing. So that does have an impact, but across lots of different areas. But we have different things going on in science and engineering to perhaps other areas. So I don't think it's to do with that. I think a lot of it, though, is to do with a lack of understanding of the things that might exclude people. And it's interesting for me because I've been discriminated against like a lot of times, but it's really funny. So I often get asked to talk about women's stuff and inclusivity, and I think it's important, right? And obviously do research in this area and so on, because it is important, right? It's important that we get better, because it's important for science and for research that we get better, if that's the way that you want to look at it, right? Because we're missing out on a lot of talent. But asking me, I often get asked for my personal view on this, and asking someone like me, I'm like the wrong person to ask because I'm still here, right? So somebody makes a joke and I'm just like, oh, eye roll, like move on. Right? I'm not really that bothered about it. For other people, it's genuinely upsetting, and it makes them feel like, I felt actually really awkward coming into this room anyway. I know I'm underrepresented, and I've just had that confirmed. And so, so these little things make a really big difference. The language we use, the way we respond to people. And everybody makes mistakes all the time, by the way. I've made tons of mistakes, right? Loads and loads of mistakes where I've reflected afterwards and thought, okay, I probably wouldn't do that again, because I've made assumptions about the group I'm with. I've made kind of like assumptions about people's social identities, or I've said something that would be exclusionary of someone else. We all do it all the time. So I think it's just a question of trying to understand what those issues are, but really trying to get to the root of it and not being defensive about it. I'm happy to admit I've made mistakes, not being defensive about it, just going, actually, this is how societies exist. This is how they are. We're recognizing these problems, and can we then, as we identify these issues, do something to change them? So it's just kind of work in progress, I guess. Work in progress.
I have time for another question. Mark? Okay. Mark, you're the last.
Thanks. Yeah, very interesting talk. And at the end, you were talking about this difference between belonging and inclusivity.
Yeah.
I don't know, can you make any kind of practical comments on How do you
How do we do it?
give people a sense of belonging in a group versus just being, if you're the in group, being inclusive?
I suppose I think it's quite challenging. I think though there are things around being being accepting of difference is really important. So inclusivity kind of has this idea of, well, here's how we do things here, and we're going to invite you in, right? That kind of thing. Whereas I think when you're thinking about belonging, what you want is for say, we're here and we hold this set of professional values and we're interested in solving these problems. And actually, none of the other stuff matters. You're still welcome. And so it's about kind of valuing that. And then I think in fairly general terms, setting up environments where people feel sort of able to be themselves and able to speak and so on. They don't have to conform to a particular way of doing things. And that is really tough. It's really difficult. It's really difficult. I mean, there are even things, how should we structure our social events? So, for example, thinking again about sort of childcare and stuff like that, should we have events in the evening? So my personal view as someone who does go to them now and did go to them when I was younger, but had a period of time where I didn't in the middle, is yes, I think we should. I think they're really important. I think they're a great way of kind of building community. But it's challenging, right? But I think that, again, recognizing that this is, and actually saying, it doesn't really matter if you can't come to the meal. You're still really welcome, and we still want to hear from you during the day. And we're not going to put that sort of emphasis on, all of the important stuff happening outside of there. But it's difficult. It's difficult.
Carolyn, thank you very much for opening up our day. Carolyn J, everyone. Our next presentation is Chris Richardson from University of Cambridge and the Alan Turing Institute.